explaining a little bit about who we are. My name is Jerry Wasserman. I'm the chairman. And sitting over at that table over there, you can raise your hand when I mention your names, is Pat Manley, who is our vice chair. And we have Cindy Knock. Well, Pat Manley is a finance committee member in Holliston. Cindy Knock is a school committee member in Carlisle and Concord and the regional school. Betsy Krager is our treasurer, and she is a selectwoman in Winchester. And Lee Anderson is a school committee member in Wayland, and she is our membership person. And we have Nancy Gallagher, who is a school committee member in Walpole, and she is also our legislative liaison. The Suburban Coalition was formed in the 80s by a number of local communities west of Boston. And since then, we have grown into a larger group of over 50 communities. Our members are not individuals, but our boards of selectmen and school committees. In some communities, the selectmen belong, in some the school committee, and some both. Our purpose is to speak for our member communities at the state level. There is no secret why our membership has grown over the years. They started in the 80s with about 14 members, and we now have typically each year about 50, or between 50 and 60 parents that belong. And these communities have problems, and that's why they need a voice. Problems centered on the reliance in our communities on the property tax, which in the view of the coalition is the most regressive of taxes. It is not based on wealth, but only on the value of your home, which means, for example, that people who have moved to our towns in the 40s and 50s and 60s have very expensive homes now, but they have not a lot of money, and when the taxes get very heavy, it becomes a problem. Related to that, we look at issues such as education funding, because education is the 600-pound gorilla in every town's budget. Special education and special education legislation. Issues about roads and infrastructure. Issues about open space and affordable housing. And obviously we'll hear conversations and questions about those throughout the night. Coalition, like everyone else, is aware of the downturn in the economy and the difficulties that the state faces. But we do still feel that the issues that we're addressing can't be ignored and need to be addressed even in difficult times. With that, I'd like to introduce the candidates. And right to my right, not necessarily politically, is former Senator Warren Tolman. Next to him is Secretary of the Commonwealth. I understand it's not Secretary of State, but Secretary of the Commonwealth, Bill Galvin. And to his right is Treasurer Shannon O'Brien. And what we're going to do in this first round, and let me tell you that Steve Grossman is coming, but he did expect to be late. But in this first round, we will have a 5-minute opening statement from each candidate, and we will do it alphabetically, if I can figure that out. And that means that Secretary Galvin will begin.
Thank you, Mr. Wasserman. Thank you very much, and thank to all of your members in your group. I think all of us in this room recognize that we in New England, and particularly in Massachusetts, have a unique political heritage. And that heritage is a commitment to the autonomy of our local communities. Over hundreds of years, that has been a very positive aspect of our political life. And I think you fulfill that in your responsibilities in your respective communities. And I think it is beneficial to our communities to have that kind of independence and that kind of autonomy. But at the same time, I think we do have a number of problems that go far beyond an individual community's ability to help, ability to solve. And moreover, we have a greater commitment to all of our citizens throughout Massachusetts. There are certain fundamentals, whether they be education, transportation, or in the case of housing, clearly a necessity of life, things that are absolutely necessities of life that have to be addressed by our state government and should not be left simply on the shoulders of the cities and towns. I've had the good fortune over the last 6 years as Secretary of State to have the ability to work very closely with cities and towns. And I think I appreciate more the activities of cities and towns than perhaps anyone else in the state because I work so closely with them. I had the ability to build a network for the implementation of the motor voter law for the first time, wiring up all the cities and towns of Massachusetts on one system. And just most recently, I worked very closely with cities and towns on the Census 2000, to establish their proper populations. So I appreciate the role of cities and towns. Politically, we've worked very carefully and closely with their officials. But I also understand as a state official the greater obligation we all have to resolve some of the issues, such as housing, such as education and transportation, that you're particularly concerned about. And I see this last decade as having been one of failure. The fact of the matter is, we have not addressed the problems that are there, despite the fact that times have been relatively prosperous. Now, as we enter into a more limited time, and financial opportunities are fewer, we still have these very grave and deepening problems that need to be addressed. I'd like to mention to you my philosophy, because I think that's very important as we address these problems. I don't think we can address these problems by leaving them to the private sector, and I don't think we can address them by ignoring them. I think we have to acknowledge the responsibility of state government to make sure we have adequate education for all of our children wherever they live. I think we have to acknowledge the responsibility of state government to make sure that housing is decent for our citizens, that making sure that they have the ability to find decent housing is not only important for them and their families, but it's also important for the health of our economy in the state. And I think we have to recognize that a good transportation system affecting all of our communities and giving our communities the ability to reach each other is very fundamental. In addressing these issues, we have to recognize not only the current physical problems, but we have to recognize that the state has not addressed them in a comprehensive way. Because of the Big Dig, for instance, we have not addressed in a comprehensive way the needs of communities. We still don't have a price tag on that, even though that is draining the resources of our state. In the matter of education, while I think there has been a very good effort, much of the emphasis over the last few years in education reform has been simply about making a buzzword out of MCAS, a comparison that has not served us all well. It seems to me that these are the types of things that need to be addressed in the next 4 years. We need to make sure that housing in Massachusetts is a priority. It has not been a priority over the last 10 years. We have seen the number of affordable housing units not increase dramatically, yet the pressure has been put on cities and towns, oftentimes to accept developments that they're uncomfortable with and that further drain their resources and further divide demographically the people of Massachusetts. These are things that need to be worked on and managed. And the essence to solving any problem, as you well know, working in your community, is day-to-day diligence and management. I believe I have the opportunity and the credentials to bring those management skills to address these problems, and moreover, I have the commitment to do so. That's why I will be seeking your support. Thank you very much.
Next up is Treasurer O'Brien.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the members of the coalition for having us here tonight. I think that September 11th makes all of us think very closely about what our priorities are. I know that when my husband and I sit at our breakfast table and our 2-year-old daughter Reagan and we think about what is important to us, the priorities have been changed since September 11th. We think about family, we think about our friends. Well, in the public realm, I think that many of us have to reprioritize at this point in time. Public safety has become a tremendously important issue, one that I think many months ago we probably hadn't been thinking about on a day-to-day basis. But while our priorities have changed a little bit since September 11th, many of the challenges, many of the issues that all of us, when we get up every single day and we sit at our breakfast table, we think about important issues that have an impact on our lives every single day. Those issues are making sure that our children have the best quality education that we can provide as a Commonwealth and as a community. It's making sure that we have health care that's affordable and accessible. It's making sure that people have jobs that can support their families. Now, all of these challenges have been considerably impacted not only by the September 11th terrorist attack, which will add significant cost to doing business here in Massachusetts. But prior to that, we'd seen the economy slow. During the summer, we saw revenues dropping, we saw people losing their jobs. In spite of these challenges, but actually, and because of these challenges, that is why I'm running for governor of Massachusetts, because I think that we need someone who has the experience and the leadership to get the job done. Now, I think I come by that optimism. I think that I do have that optimism about where we can be going in the future. It comes from being a child here in Massachusetts, growing up. I learned that from my parents. And a long time ago, I remember saying to my dad, you want to be just like my dad. You want to go to Yale. I think that's great. Well, back when I was a little kid, I didn't even know that you couldn't go to Yale if you were a girl. But all my dad said to me was, Shannon, if you work hard and you really put your mind to it, you can get the job done. You can do whatever you want. You know what? I worked hard, and I was able to actually get into Yale, and by the time I was able to apply for college, women were accepted to that school. So I think that that was a tremendous lesson that I learned as a young child. Apply yourself, work hard, and you can accomplish just about anything you set out to do. And I learned another lesson once I got to Yale. I actually played soccer when I was at Yale. I was the captain of the women's soccer team. Now, soccer back then wasn't as popular as it is in a lot of communities today, but I learned some very important lessons that getting kicked in the shins, playing soccer, is very good training for being in the Massachusetts legislature. When I got elected at age 26 years old to the Massachusetts legislature, I learned a couple of the lessons that I think are very important to anyone who's going to be a good governor leading us forward. I learned how to work with people. I learned how to get things done. I learned how to build coalitions to make sure that we can push different agenda items forward. And I had some success. We were able to pass some legislation in Massachusetts, the investment tax credit, that I believe has been a contributing factor to some of the good economic times that we've had here in Massachusetts over the past half dozen years or so. I was a tireless advocate for children and families, passed child abuse legislation to protect those children. I also worked very hard to reduce the cost of health insurance that communities had to pay for in their local budgets. Now, being a legislator is one thing, and many of us here, well, all three of us here actually at the podium, have all been legislators, and that is indeed very good training for being governor. We have to be able to work together to move our agenda forward. But one of the things that I think makes my candidacy stand out is the ability to lead, the ability to be a CEO, the ability to be a manager and an administrator during very tough times. Now, any of you who've read the newspaper articles from January and February and March and beyond of 1999 know what I was faced with when I came into the state treasurer's office. Literally, state employees were stealing tens of millions of dollars out of the state's treasury. We went in, we changed the way the Commonwealth managed its resources, managed its money, and we had to restore the public's confidence that we were managing taxpayer dollars day in and day out. We did that, we got that done, and I believe we restored the public's confidence.
Okay, third up is Senator Warren Toole.
Thank you. And thank you to the Suburban Coalition for hosting this. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to talking with the issues of concern to the Suburban Coalition. Before I do, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself, where I come from, and why I'm running for governor. I'm running for governor because I believe the system is broken. I believe I have the independence, the passion, the knowledge, and the experience to fix it. Let me tell you a little bit what I mean by that. I grew up in Watertown. I'm the seventh of 8 kids. My dad was a railroad conductor. My mother was a telephone operator. Time and again, it was democratic and governmental initiatives and opportunities that provided my family with an opportunity. Specifically, when my parents first started their family, they started in the Fidelis Way Housing Project in Boston, a federal housing program, offering my parents an opportunity to have a roof over their head. I grew up in Watertown, as I said, and I went to the Watertown Public Schools. I graduated from Watertown High, was the first kid in my family to go to college, and the first kid in 25 years to go to Amherst College. I was able to go to Amherst through work study and student loan programs that, again, the government provided an opportunity for a working class kid to go to one of the best schools. And I was able to compete academically with other kids from all over the nation at one of the nation's best schools. I believe, unfortunately, that these programs and initiatives are not serving the purpose, and there's been a significant disconnect between them and the populace. Sadly, I believe people have lost faith in the system. In fact, if you look at the indicia of voter registration
and voting participation. You can see clear evidence of that. In the last primary in 2000, just about 10% of the people in Massachusetts took the time to vote. In the nation's last presidential election was one of the lowest turnouts in our nation's history, 51%. At the same time, we have more money than ever before influencing the political process. Over $3 billion was spent encouraging people to vote in the 2000 election. We know what the results were. Special interests are spending more money than ever before on Beacon Hill, $48 million last year, a 12% increase over the last year, and they're spending more money because they're getting more results. I know. I was a state rep. I was a state senator. I saw it. I saw what happened when the deregulation of the utility industry took place. They promised us three things. They promised us lower rates, more competition, and better service. I think they're 0 for 3. I know when it took 10 years, why it took 10 years to pass a Clean Rivers bill in Massachusetts. Special interest lobbyists stopping it every step of the way. I know because I was a co-sponsor of that legislation. I know what it is to take on the tobacco industry and beat them back. I fought back 17 different lobbyists fighting for the tobacco industry. Special interests. That's why I'm running as a clean elections candidate. I'm the only candidate running as a clean elections candidate. I believe that when 1.1 million people vote for something, 67% by the way, as they did in November 1998, it ought to mean something. It ought to mean something. I'm standing tall and trying to fight to take big money out of the political process so that we can focus on the issues that really matter, that really ought to be of concern to all of us in Massachusetts. So we can focus on public education, where my 2 children are in the public schools. So we can focus on affordable housing for other families like my mom and dad who are looking to get that start today. We can focus on health care, affordable health care, and prescription drug for seniors that are fighting and just trying to decide whether they should pay their rental bill or the prescription drug costs. We have a lot of work to do in Massachusetts, but now more than ever we need leadership. We need someone who's going to stand up against the status quo, who's going to fight against business as usual. There's a real mentality that permeates the Beacon Hill gang up there. I've stood up for reform. I stood up for oversight on the big dig against the MWRA and scaled it back. Stood up for the last meaningful campaign finance reform and ethics legislation to pass. I'm going to continue standing up. Those are the values that my mother taught me, my father taught me, to stand up for what you believe in, to fight hard, and to listen to people. I believe now more than ever, we need someone who's not going to just talk the talk, someone who's going to walk the walk, and stand up against business as usual and fight to make Massachusetts the best place it can be to work and to live and to raise a family. Thank you.
Before we begin the next round. One is I would ask Lee Anderson to pass out to the audience 3x5 cards so that you can write down a question, and she'll be collecting them later. And the officers will select the best of the questions to ask. Secondly, I neglected to introduce one of our officers, Ms. Dorothy Presser, who is our secretary. And she is from Linfield and on the school committee there. In the next round, well, before that I have one other thing I just heard about, is that Steve Grossman is not here tonight. He has a very serious family medical situation he's dealing with and won't be able to attend. So I thought we would make, instead of 2.5 minutes, give you each a rounded off to 3 for this next round, with questions specifically from the Suburban Coalition officers. Since one of our major focuses is Chapter 70, I would ask Nancy Galvin from Walpole to ask the first question. Yes, before we want to alternate who begins, so this time I think we'll start with Treasurer O'Brien.
Put in a funding formula and stick with the funding that they committed themselves to. One of the issues for suburban towns, though, is the money has been given at a disproportionate rate to the poorer cities and towns, as it needed to have been. I guess my question is, well, it's a question and a comment. Once all the cities and towns had reached foundation level, the goal in many ways was met by the funding formula. And what's now happening, if we continue with that same formula, the disproportionate amounts of money that are given out create probably some unintended consequences. And I wonder how you would look at changes that need to happen and have been being discussed for the last 2 years, and we're looking for a change in the funding formula. And so my question is, what do you see as a possible way of moving forward in terms of education funding? Just a couple of specifics. In Walpole, as well as in the town of Winchester, we have come to very, very severe financial times. We had a failed override last spring, and it was the first time an override had been proposed in a good long while. It caused us to have to lay off 28 teachers. We had to lay off custodians, police, fire, DPW workers. We lost our school superintendent. We lost our town administrator. And to me, one of the big red flags that people always hear when towns are nearing this situation, and I know from talking with Betsy that they're concerned about their high school's accreditation probably not being able to be maintained. These are the systems that are achieving well. So as much as the premise of more money needs to go to the poorer towns does hold up, at the same point, we can't have our systems that are achieving have unaccredited high schools.
Well, I mean, I think that we have to remember where this education reform act came from in the first place. And the Duffy case decided back in the early 90s mandated that the Commonwealth basically take away the advantages of disadvantage. You lived in a local community or you lived in a poor community. All children were required to have the same opportunity to get an adequate education. Now, when the funding schedules were initially put in place, they tried to be as fair as they could. They obviously wanted to, they had to give greater supports to poorer communities that had fewer resources. And obviously, all the communities that already were spending above the foundation budget were going to get a lesser subsidy. But there were some problems in that funding. There were some communities, and I remember this debate when I was a legislator, we were deciding how this was going to be worked out. There were some communities that didn't have the same level of commitment, and frankly, a lesser level of commitment perhaps than they could even afford to do. There were some communities that even based on their wealth had a greater commitment. They had spent more money on schools. So the levels of resources that were given to those communities literally were baked in back when we passed this legislation in the 90s. So over the years, those inequities, I mean, there are communities that have relatively similar levels of wealth and similar resources, in essence, to tax and to create local resources that have widely disparate rates of reimbursement from the Commonwealth. So I think all of us understand that from community to community that there needs to be a look at the formula to make sure that it is fair. However, I know that one of the issues that your group is looking at is a minimum 25% of funding level towards the foundation budget. That in and of itself will cost approximately $100 million as reported by the Department of Education. I want to be very honest with you. I don't know where we're going to find an additional $100 million given the budget constraints that we have right now to do that. So the commitment that I would make is every single year we have to work to make sure that education is held harmless from the vagaries of the budgetary cuts. There are going to be other areas that are going to have to see cutbacks, but every single year we should be putting more money into the education system. That every community every year does better. That is the bottom line. Second, I think that we have to work very diligently to make sure that we do better to fund our special education, because all communities are severely impacted by that special education budget. But lastly, if the pie stays relatively the same, it's very difficult for us to be taking money away from the poorer communities, because those communities are still not living up to the expectations of the NCAS test. So I think what we have to do is look at that formula, go back, see how we can make it.
Time.
Just make one last point, but the process has to be there. The governor, the legislature have to work together, because what we see is a politicized process whereby 3 different sets of numbers are put out, and depending on how well your town does, you decide you want to do the governor's plan, or the House's plan, or the Senate's plan. We have to have communication working together so that there's one set of numbers, so that we take some of the politics out of this very, very thorny issue of who's going to win and who's going to lose.
I have to be consistent. Okay, Senator Tom.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Nancy. First, let me say that I'm a product of the public schools. My kids, my 2 school-age children are in the Watertown Public Schools now, and during my year between college and law school, I worked in the public schools as a substitute teacher. So I care a lot about the public schools and public education in Massachusetts. It's done a lot for me. Some of the most influential people in my life are some of those public school teachers that I met along the way in the Watertown schools. And I can't help but think, as I walk my daughter to school, as I often do, I wonder, whether she's getting all the tools that she needs to, as I hear teachers lament about spending their own money to pay for classroom supplies and the like. Well, let me say this right up front. I don't believe any community during this day, prior to September 11th certainly, should be talking about laying off 28 teachers. That is clearly something that was not anticipated in the Education Reform Act, and it's frankly a unfairness of the funding formula, in my opinion. I remember debating that, and I was in the legislature at the time, and I remember asking questions about that formula, and it was clear that no one quite understood the very long and complex formula that took into account many, many different aspects of what makes up a community. That funding formula, particularly, I believe, in looking at it 7 or 8 years later, needs to be rectified to support some above foundation communities, like communities that I represented when I was in the state senate, that are hamstrung by not getting the state assistance that other communities are. At the same time, they're capped on their 2.5 and what they can do for the ever regressive property tax. At the same time, there are a number of communities that have high growth in population that are not, again, the funding formula does not take that into account. And finally, the third inequity is I think the state ought to be doing what it can, and I think more than it is, to help communities with special education costs. Kids that 20 or 30 years ago would have died at birth are living, and they go into the public school systems, and thank goodness they're living, but they go into the public school systems and can cost an inordinate amount to educate with around-the-clock attention to help them get through the public school system. Those are inordinate costs that weren't anticipated 20 or odd years ago, and we need to make sure that the state is there to support those communities. I am one that certainly I recognize the fiscal realities that are there, but I want to see us invest in public education more than what we are doing today. I want to see us pushing communities towards full-day kindergarten. Not just a few communities, as is currently about 37% of the communities across the state, but all communities. We ought to be striving towards full-day kindergarten. That's where the action is in the development of a child's brain. That's where we ought to be focusing our resources. Thanks.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think all of us in this room recognize that to some extent the discussion we're having about the formula is certainly subject to and secondary to the immediate need to make sure that the Chapter 7 assistance for the fiscal year we're now in is fully funded. I think that's the greatest priority we all have right now, and I think that needs to be something we need to get right out there. It's obvious that the financial limitations of the current situation are going to restrict us in many ways, but I think that Chapter 70 assistance and local aid should be held harmless. I think that has to be a high priority of the budget negotiations. The present budget negotiations are a classic example of what the problem is. Not only is it removed from public view, as it has been for so many months, public discussion, but the whole concept of how the formulas are achieved are completely removed from even the activities of groups such as yours and people such as yourselves who are involved in local government. There have been some proposals that I think do merit consideration. I know the proposals from the Foundation Budget Review Commission that was filed in June tried to address some of the issues. They pointed out, for instance, that in some of the so-called wealthier communities, the amount towards foundation funding has been increasing to the point where it now ranges from 14 to 30%. But I think the fundamental flaw in all of this is that it fails to recognize that one size does not fit all for our cities and towns. Many cities and towns have very limited commercial or industrial space. They're completely built out, or they have commitments to open space that are not going to provide them with the tax revenues. I think the long-term goal has got to be to wean away from the property tax. It is a 19th century idea, an archaic idea, that we should be funding something as fundamental as education from the property tax. And I think it is unjust and unfair to many cities and towns who find themselves in differing situations with regard to what the cumulative value of their property is, that should be the determining factor in what kind of state assistance they get. I would also say that one of the things the Commission pointed out, which is completely inexcusable, is that much of the data used in the formula is not up to date. For instance, the number of students enrolled in the system is running a year behind. There is no excuse for that. The average income is an old figure, not a new figure. That is not, again, acceptable. I also think that there has to be a recognition of the importance and the cost of special education assistance. I think that is a very key cost in local education, and as part of the formula needs to be addressed with more state contribution and a full commitment to funding. Overall, I think we have to say that the problems addressing education, I know your question anticipated this, aren't just problems of urban systems, although their problems are often more intense. I think the problems are throughout Massachusetts. I've been throughout Massachusetts. I've seen and talked to communities where there have been failed overrides. Obviously, I have reason to monitor the overrides. And I see where local students are being forced to decide they're not going to have music, they're not going to have sports, or even fundamental parts of their education being ignored or diminished. This is not acceptable. It is something we have to establish as a priority, that education is a key thing. The reason that people come to your town, the reason that people want to be in a particular community, is often the quality of the education that's in the community. You have a commitment to it, the state needs to match your commitment.
Okay, thank you. For the next question, I think we will go to Vincent Krieger.
First of all, being on the Board of Selectmen here in Winchester, I'd like to welcome you to our lovely community. Well, we're a W town, and we have a reputation for being wealthy. One of the things that I'd like to fill you in on is just give you a little case study here in our town.
Excuse me, yes, with the mic up for people in the back.
Sure. Like many other communities, we are virtually entirely dependent on the property tax. What this has done for us since the advent of Prop 2.5 is that for what the problem that we are really having, this is just for the TV. This is just for the TV. The problem that we are really having is that as Prop 2.5 has come along, and we are stuck every year raising our tax rates to the levy limit, we really do not have an option, because we can't keep up with things like rising health care costs. We can't keep up with special education funding. We can't keep up with the crumbling infrastructure system on an inflation rate that's held artificially low. We simply can't do it. So what are we facing next year? We're already anticipating a general override for both capital and operating budget items. Without that, in the lovely town of Winchester, the wealthy town of Winchester, we're looking at laying off yet again probably DPW workers. We already lost 8% of our staff there last year. We're looking at probably laying off public safety staff in an era of where public safety and security is a key item. We're looking at a school system that, while we have frequently supported it to the tune of approximately 60% of our budget, I don't know how we will be able to continue to do so. It's very, very problematic for us. We're looking at dramatic cuts. Our capital budgets have been our principal source of our ongoing operating budgets. We've got fields that are not maintained. We've got buildings that we cannot possibly adequately maintain. Our DPW director has told us that our building maintenance alone, let alone roads or anything else, is underfunded annually to the tune of about $600,000 or $700,000. we can't meet our necessary operating costs. Yet, at the same time, because we are so dependent on the property tax, if we pass a Prop 2.5 override, we have a significant senior population. We are also being hit over the head by the state about affordable housing. Rising property taxes do nothing to make housing more affordable. In fact, it only makes the problem worse, and particularly for many of those who can least afford it. Because of these greater impacts, particularly on our infrastructure and our roads, our buildings, as well as our playing fields, my question to you revolves principally around one area where the state has funded regularly, but at a lower level, and that is with respect to Chapter 90. We've got lots of other areas. If you were watching your television sets last March, we're flood central. But and we're looking at something down the road, we may have to fund up to, $10 to $12 million, and I don't know where we're going to be able to get all of that. But that's a separate issue. But if you could address Chapter 90.
Apparently we have a problem, but there's no hall mic over there, so I'm going to ask whoever does a question if you should come over here to ask the question. But just to recap, basically, Betsy explained the problems that Winchester has been through, and wanted to know their view about Chapter 90 funding. And let's see, we started with...
I think it's me, Jerry.
I won't ask Betsy to repeat the question, because I could hear you fine. First of all, let me say that your lament and your tale is not unique to Winchester. It's certainly during the time I was in the state senate and represented a number of different communities, there were some seemingly affluent communities that are facing the same situation you are. Indeed, it's not particular to metropolitan Boston. If you go to Cape Cod, if you go to Western Massachusetts, you hear some of the same issues brought up time and time again. The first thing, I believe, the question regarding Chapter 90 funds, the funds for roads and highways and bridges, is an important one. And frankly, the giant sucking sound that you've been hearing the last 10 years is your Chapter 90 funds going to the Big Dig. It's a project that is totally out of control and has been for a number of years. I fought from my earliest years in the legislature to get that project under control. I pushed and was a lone voice, frankly, at the time, in 1993 and in 1994, 95, 96 for state oversight. I saw that project was going out of control. Eventually, I succeeded in getting some legislation passed, which was subsequently ignored by the Cellucci administration, to try to have some state oversight and accountability on this project. And unfortunately, because we didn't get that oversight, the project has continuously increased in cost. And I hear it, the roads are in terrible condition relative to the state that they should be. The state needs to do a better job supporting local communities on Chapter 90 funds. And frankly, as I look at what's happened over the last few years, I realize, Betsy, that the neglect that's taken place is going to cost more in the long run because we haven't provided the resources to local municipalities. And we've neglected the capital care and maintenance that will, in the long term, actually save us money. So shame on the state. Well, what can we do? Well, first of all, the crisis of today is the Big Dig and or Massport or the like. The first thing we have to do is we have to get our financial house in order. And we have to make sure that the state is not going to go down these paths on the next big project. Perhaps it's the convention center, which was $100 million out of budget in the design phase. Well, they scaled that back appropriately, so we must make sure that we never do that again. We also should be providing as much assistance as we can in Chapter 90 funds to communities. Now, I'm not going to wave a magic wand during this period and say, well, you're going to get every penny you're looking for. I'd be lying to you if I did. But the first thing I would do as governor with regard to this issue is to make sure that we get our financial house in order and scale back some of the patronage that's taken place during the last 11 years of Weld, Cellucci, Swift leadership, where you have, frankly, a patronage-laden system, and to make sure that the cities and towns are getting their fair share, because I understand that you're hamstrung by what you can do.
Secretary Gallo.
Thank you. I suspect you'll have no disagreement among this panel about the urgency of dealing with the Big Dig, because I think getting a comprehensive number on what the actual cost is going to be, at least as accurately as we can, is critical to making any decisions in the area of expenditures with regard to public construction, in particular on roadways. But it goes beyond that. The fact of the matter is there has been very little thought given to sensible planning for expenditures on highway repair. So often we see projects are rushed to get them in during the season. The highway department's plan is not visible to anybody what they're doing on major highways. There is very little public discussion of how it's going to be done. The MDC roads, for instance, which many of us use in this area, are in total disrepair. There has been no plan for repairing them. There needs to be a comprehensive plan. We have a Secretary of Transportation office, an Executive Office of Transportation, but there is no central planning. We have some responsibilities part with the Turnpike Authority. We have some responsibilities part with the MBTA. We have apparently the Highway Commissioner who seems to go off on his own. We have an MDC Commissioner who has responsibilities in highway maintenance as well. There needs to be a central plan. There also needs to be some long-term commitment. I believe that there will have to be some additional sources of revenue found to pay for the big dig. I think even those who are charged with administering it are recognizing that right now. Even the governor has seemingly recognized there have to be additional sources of revenue. But no one is looking for a comprehensive plan. That is the ultimate answer to your problem. I think all of us understand that the maintenance that's being deferred here is going to come back to cost a lot more later. And I also think we recognize that other concerns about transportation, such as public transportation, rail transportation, others, are also being adversely affected by this. I think the first and foremost issue has to be coming up with a plan. How much is the big dig going to cost, and how are we going to pay for it, and how are we going to meet these other obligations that are so critical? And until we have honesty and some accountability, we won't get an answer to your question.
Thank you. Treasurer O'Brien.
One of the things that I've been working very hard at doing as state treasurer is basically cutting the cost of debt and cutting the cost of interest. The big dig has helped drive our state's debt load to such levels that we literally are the third highest state in the nation in terms of the debt that we're carrying here in Massachusetts. We've worked very hard to cut literally hundreds of millions of dollars from the overall cost of interest that we have to pay to taxpayers. The good news is we're not going to have to go back to people for that $200, $300, $400 million, and monies we'll be able to use for other productive costs. Now, one of the other things that we did on top of helping to cut the cost of paying back the big dig is we literally blew the whistle. Our office finally blew the whistle and got them to come clean about the real cost of the big dig. But we blew the whistle on something else. We blew the whistle on the fact that for a number of years they were diverting funds that were going to go to local communities to pay for those road and bridge projects. That's one of the reasons why you've deferred some of your maintenance, because money that was supposed to be coming out to these communities was being held back. So we blew the whistle on that and made sure that the state kept its promise to communities to provide those local funds for your local projects. And we have to make sure we have honesty in state government, because the longer we don't tell the truth, the more expensive it's going to be. Now, going forward, we have to continue to make sure that we cut those costs at every turn. We have to make sure that we do have a plan. We've been very critical about the fact that this administration hasn't had a plan in terms of figuring out what the long-term cost of things will be. They don't have a plan about paying for Chapter 90 funds. So what I think we have to do, I think the Secretary makes a good point. There has to be a long-term plan. We have to work together to get this done. But I'll give you one example of why this administration has their priorities wrong. First of all, a year ago, they told us that we could pass question 4. A lot of the problems we talked about in terms of your funding needs, they told us we could pass question 4 without any cuts to local aid, without any cuts to the highway fund, and that's just not true. It wasn't true then, and it's not true now. But this is where we are. So we have to be working together to solve some of these problems. And one of the biggest criticisms I've had of this current government, this current administration, is the lack of reaching out. We hear them calling for the resignation of board members at the Turnpike who've been pressing the issue about what's the true cost of big deeds. Do we have less expensive alternatives? Rather than working with them, rather than picking up the telephone and saying, let's all work together this question. The acting governor calls for their resignation. I think that they raise real legitimate issues for the short term as well as the long term. But the most important thing that you need from your governor is to make sure that, one, you understand the global issues, you roll up your sleeves, you're not afraid to speak up, and you're not afraid to do the hard work and make the tough choices to get the job done. Chapter 90, I made a commitment. I work very hard to make sure that we maintain a level of $100 million in Chapter 90 funds. I think that that's what we owe to our communities. We've seen a low during the last recession, about $40 million, a high, about $150 million. I don't think that we're going to, given the budget constraints right now, maintain that high of $150 million. But we need to work hard to make a commitment to local communities because we did hold that money back. We weren't giving you that money that we had promised to you. So I do think that we have to work hard to make sure that we maintain that $100 million level of spending in Chapter 90 funds.
Thank you. For the next question, we're going to trust that Pat Manley is going to speak very loud and rely on the acoustics of the auditorium.
Which I've been told are wonderful. Is there anyone who can't hear me?
Well, they wouldn't be able to raise their hand.
That was a joke. There are those who want to repeal parts of the special education bill of the year 2000. Do you support the bill that was passed? And will you advocate to see it fully funded? And are there any other changes that you would like to see made to the special education?
Okay, yes.
You are correct, sir. Thank you. I do support it. I think the importance of special education has been demonstrated by the success that we've had here in Massachusetts. Now, that success, of course, does not mean that there shouldn't be changes in the program as it reflects the realities of the situation. I have to tell you that in terms of fully funding, I think we're all limited by the actual resources that we have. And it would be disingenuous to simply say, yes, I'm for fully funding it, but there isn't money enough to do it. I do regard it as a high priority. What other changes would I perceive? I would certainly suggest, again, that the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, in particular relating to vocational education students and others, might be more appropriate in terms of building it into as a higher percentage of the formula. I think that we have to recognize that clearly we have an obligation to special needs children, and I think we have to acknowledge the success that we've had. I do think it oftentimes is unfair to certain communities that get extremely burdened by it and are not able to provide services within their particular community. They have to go to outside sources where the costs are very great. But I think this is a particular example of a real state obligation. If we have, as we do, an obligation to all children to give them a decent education, it seems to me we have even a greater obligation to those with special needs to achieve the most that they can possibly achieve.
Thank you. Treasurer.
I share the Secretary's concern about full funding for special education. I think that this has been a burden that we have left to communities for too long, and I do think that the state has to step up to the plate. I know that the costs are going to be significant, but I do think that this is one area that we have to provide special focus and attention. Over the course of the past several years, we have seen a number of attempts on the federal level to bring more money back from the federal government. I believe that the next government has to be working hand in hand with our legislative delegation. We saw and we were very excited about the fact that earlier this summer, it appeared that we were on the verge of being able to get additional funding up to that originally anticipated 40% level of funding from the federal government. That is one of the things that our next government is going to have to do, is to work closely with the federal government to make sure that these additional funds will be there to help our kids. I do think that we also need to make sure that we are working to incent communities. I like the idea of supporting collaborative programs where you have communities that work together to help cut the overall cost of special education. I think that we should be doing everything that we can to promote that as well. So we should be doing the best that we can to fund that. I know I actually checked today, and the total cost of fully funding the special education budget is upwards of $130 to $140 million. It's a very big price tag, but we have to do everything that we can to get as close as we can to that full funding level. It's imperative. It's the right thing that we can do for our kids, and also I think we should be giving a those federal funds back.
Senator Tolman.
Thank you. Thanks, Betsy. First of all, I did not support the changes in the special ed, unlike my counterparts, however, I do believe that we ought to be fully funding special education. Let me tell you specifically why. One of my heroes is Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey said, "The moral test of government is how it treats those in the dawn of life, the children, those in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the disabled, and those in the twilight of life, the seniors." And I believe those children in particular, particularly children of special needs, ought to be handled and treated with the very best care that our state and our municipalities can muster. And I'm afraid that with some of the changes in the special education law that we're going to leave some children behind. It's a real concern of mine. It's certainly a concern of some of the leading experts in this area. Specifically with regard to your question on funding, I live in Watertown. Watertown is a community that happens to be the home of the world-renowned Perkins School for the Blind. As a result, we can be a magnet for a number of severely disabled children who move into the community and consequently require town services that are very significant. I don't believe that because Watertown happens to be the home of Perkins that we should necessarily bear the lion's share of those costs. It's unfair to a community to expect that. I'm also concerned that we're a family with one or two disabled children requiring significant around-the-clock assistance moves into a particular community, say in mid-academic season. They can significantly decimate a community's special education budget with little recourse for that community to take specific actions. It's unfair to that community. The state is not doing enough here. We need to do more.
Thank you. For our last question from the officers, we'll turn to Cindy Knott. She's going to speak really loud.
Last night, the Community Preservation Act won in 5 towns and lost in 8. The fact is only a small number of communities have adopted it thus far. What, in your view, are the problems with the act, and how would you change it, if at all?
I believe, Mr. Treasurer. Chair.
In terms of I think at this point in time, it's still very new, and it has not been obviously fully accepted by the people. I'm actually, in my hometown of East Hampton, is one of the 5 communities that actually opted for it. I'm in shock. This is a community that wouldn't even pay for health care benefits for some of its retirees, that I'm amazed to find that they had a commitment to housing and to historic and open space preservation. I think that this is a great experiment. I think that this is an important way that the state can share the burden of incenting communities to create, especially in my mind, greater housing opportunities. The fact that they are willing to step up to the plate, I think, is a good first step. Obviously, the other 50% that has to be borne by local communities is not always an easy or cheap thing to do. But this is something that, given the constraints of the budget climate that we're in right now, I believe is a very good first step. And I would like to see more communities, if indeed put in with their local plans, I would like to see more communities adopt this. I think that it's a good, very good first step.
I see the CPA, part of this is an educative process where people are going to learn more about it and decide whether they want it. I happen to have supported a stronger version for communities in which there was actually a transfer fee, so that if someone sold their home at $600,000, some portion of that $600,000, was usually an exemption in the range of $300,000 to $400,000, was tax exempt, and then the individual would have a fee on the remaining $200,000. I felt that that was a more equitable way to do things, so that when you actually sold your home and you had a significant windfall, you paid some small portion, 1% above a certain amount of $300,000 or $400,000 to help your local community. Again, it was up to municipalities to adopt it. It was significantly fought by the real estate industry, the special interests that, frankly, in my view, have way too much clout and way too much influence on Beacon Hill. I fought back then. I was not successful, but I'm going to continue
to see that the Community Preservation Act is as strong as it can be, so the communities can work on issues like affordable housing and historic preservation and acquisition of open space. One of the things that the state ought to be doing here in conjunction with these efforts is to help municipalities plan regionally. Sometimes the issues that Winchester focuses on are very similar to all of the communities around them, but there's not always the regional effort and regional planning that ought to take place. The state could and should play more of a role providing for assistance with communities so that they can work more collaboratively, because Winchester's problems are indeed the problems of the communities around it, like Arlington, that grapple with the same issues along Route 60 as Winchester does. That's a role that the state ought to play to help communities as they grapple with these issues, to try to maintain a high quality and a high standard of living.
Thank you. I supported the Community Preservation Act, and I'm excited about the fact that so many communities have accepted it, and I'm actually hopeful that in perhaps better economic times, or at least more certain economic times, more will. But I see the CPA as only a portion of the answer to the housing problem. And frankly, I think the state government has failed to address this problem. If you look at the number of units that would qualify as low-income housing or affordable housing, you recognize immediately that over the last 10 years in particular, the state has failed to acknowledge that housing is a necessity of life that we should be trying to produce. I have several suggestions. First of all, I think we need to consider or reconsider the mission of the many state agencies that are allegedly dealing with housing, whether it's MFHA or the various other agencies that deal with it, because it seems to me they're more at this point about bureaucracy than achieving the mission. Secondly, I think we need, and I would suggest, we've had an excellent example in my office of creating a library of zoning, create an inventory of available spaces, housing space and others. That's quite achievable today. Very easy to do. I can tell you from the registries of deeds that will be very determinable. And in creating an inventory of what's out there, we begin to see where there are opportunities, both by overlaying the zoning and knowing what's out there for additional housing. But the state has got to step up to the line. We have state lands, we have the potential for state finance, and we have to make sure that this is not just simply an obligation we cast on cities and towns. This should not be do as we say, it should be do as we do. And the state needs to get up and step up to the line here and provide more assistance and planning for these areas. I fear that in some cases communities are being overwhelmed by people coming in, maybe in good faith, trying to address affordable housing issues under 40B, but in some cases they've been overwhelmed by it. I think the state has a greater obligation. I think it needs to address the necessity of housing. You know, when you consider the plight of working people in Massachusetts to find a decent place to live, it's almost impossible. And if you ignore that, you also ignore the ramifications it has for our state's economy. So I think this is an important priority, and I would be very eager to work on it.
Thank you. For the next round, we are going to go to some very good questions from the audience that I have here. And since I've got the only mic that works in the hall other than the candidates, I'm just going to read them. First one, and I believe we start with Senator Tolman. Given the current and projected economic condition, is it possible to place a moratorium on the income tax rollback? And I'll add, would recommend that if you were governor?
My feelings on this are that the first thing we ought to be doing is to be dealing with the state budget crisis. We're now 130 days after a budget was supposed to have been enacted. It was supposed to be July 1st. It's November. It's time to get the budget passed, and it's time to address the fiscal year 2002 budget. That's the first thing. I think the first thing we ought to be talking about should not be repealing or delaying or freezing the will of the voters last November. When the people speak, as they have, about an initiative petition, I believe that ought to count for something. That's what my stand on clean elections comes from. That's where my position towards the state income tax question is. Some leaders on Beacon Hill, the first thing they want to turn to is to subvert the will of the voters. Look, these are serious fiscal times. But we have a rainy day account, which is now $1.7 billion. We have an additional $600 million approximately left over from fiscal year 2001. We have tobacco funds that are available in the range of $250 million that come in on a yearly basis. Those are all avenues for revenue that we ought to be looking towards. At the same time, we ought to be looking to cut and scale back our budget where appropriate. Look at what happened at Massport. We've seen 180 people laid, and I know Massport is not directly on the state budget, but it's a clear indication of what has happened in state government over the past 11 years. They laid off 180 people, they cut back, and we can do that in other areas of state government, to cut out the patronage, cut out the bureaucracy, and cut out the business as usual. Once we start to do that, can we talk about these other issues?
Thank you. I'm leaving you 3 minutes for each of these.
Okay.
Secretary Dell.
Thank you. I would support a delay, but I think it has to be part of a comprehensive plan. And I haven't seen that yet. I don't think anybody in this room knows what the budget plan is. I think there has to be a plan, and we have to know what the bottom line is and what the cuts are going to be. I also think that if there is to be, and as I said, it's a conditional support, if there is to be, it should be to make sure that priorities of spending are obliged. And I mean by that local aid and perhaps some urgent public safety needs. They should be the priority. That should be the condition of that. I simply do not think it should be postponed without any conditions. I think it really depends upon an overall budgetary picture. It seems that today the legislature has agreed that the shortfall appears to be about $1.3 billion. It seems today that the legislative leaders have agreed that they're willing to go into the rainy day fund, so-called, to the amount of approximately $450 to $500 million. If that is the case, this might be part of the solution, but it has to be as part of a comprehensive plan. We shouldn't be playing a shell game to guess where it's going to come out. We shouldn't be trying to figure out what it is that they're going to do. And again, it gets back to the process. Not only, and I agree with Senator Tolman, not only is the process much delayed, it's invisible. We don't know. Not a single person in this room, at least to the best of my knowledge, not a single person in this room knows what exactly the priorities for spending are. And yet, those of us who run agencies and who are familiar with the way that government runs locally know that we continue to have to do spending and make decisions without having the benefit of knowing what the bottom line is. That is simply not a way to do business, and I think we'd all agree on that.
Thank you. Treasurer O'Brien.
As governor, one of the things we have to demand is budgets that are on time and honest. I think that we've worked hard in our office in the treasurer's office to do both of those things. A year ago, I was debating then Governor Paul Cellucci against question 4 because I did not believe that cutting $1 billion in revenues out of our state's stream of resources coming into the Commonwealth, that we could do it without any cuts. I think that both Jane Swift and Paul Cellucci referred to me then as Chicken Little. Well, lo and behold, we knew that the good times couldn't roll on forever. None of us up here on the podium had any questions about a smaller tax cut, about a fair tax cut, but the fact is they made a miscalculation a year ago. That being said, the voters of this state spoke very clearly that they did support question 4. Now, when times are good, we can do a lot of things. We've seen our state's budget double since 1990. When times are good, you can do a lot of things. You can expand spending, but you know what else happens? You can get a little sloppy. You don't have to toe the bottom line quite as well because you have extra resources, and we've had that. We've had billion-dollar surpluses over the course of the past several years. Well, now we have to do, I think, what the voters said. Demonstrate to them that we're willing to fulfill their wishes. However, the first thing that we have to do right now is cut the budget. We've been doing this in our office at the Treasury. Just yesterday, we announced $17 million in cuts. We once again further reduced interest costs on the state's debt. We cut back some of our payroll. We cut back $1 million out of the lottery's budget. We're trying to make a very clear statement to the people of Massachusetts that during good times, we can afford to do this. But during tough times, we have to tighten our belt. I think that that is the message that we have to send very clearly to every single person in this state, that the first thing that we're looking at is our budget. Massport is a great example of where we got fat and happy. We need to make sure that we not only do a top-to-bottom review of Massport, but every other agency under state auspices. After we've done that review, after we've done the cutbacks that we can make, then we can look to the rainy day fund. There's been a bipartisan effort to build up a significant, nearly $2 billion rainy day fund. After we've done all those things, and we want to make those choices, and we want to go back to the people of Massachusetts to say, you know, we're going to have to choose between schools and income tax cuts, then we can go to speak to the people of Massachusetts and see whether or not that's the right decision to make. But we have to say very clearly, we're going to get our fiscal house in order, we're going to make those cutbacks, then we're going to come back to people, and only at that point in time should we even begin to consider changing the question for referendum.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions here because they're two sides of the same issue. I believe this time we start with Secretary Government. Okay. Would you support local controls for 40B with guidelines and some relaxation of the 10% formula? And on the other side of that, the Governor's Commission on Affordable Housing recommends some stronger measures, including limiting home rule more. And there have been some proposals in the legislature for penalties. So looking at both sides of this, the proposals to loosen controls and to tighten them, what is your view of the best way to handle the affordable housing crunch?
Well, I think there's pending legislation. Both the House and Senate have passed legislation to address 40B. There are some parts of it that I would support. For instance, I would be willing to support inclusion of Section 8 in the count. But there are other portions of it that I would not be willing to support. It seems to me that the Senate document overall was stronger in its support of housing. I don't think we can deny the basic necessity of housing. When I spoke a few minutes ago about this, I said I think the state has an overwhelming obligation. I don't think we can simply shove it off to cities and towns. But at the same time, I know in some instances communities have felt overwhelmed by 40B applications. And there are, again, in the pending legislation, there is an effort in both houses to address the size and the density of some of the proposals that come under the 40B process. And I would support a cap of some kind on those proposals. But I don't think we can excuse the cities and towns as a planning tool from the 40B process. I think we need housing in Massachusetts. I think the question is the state going to play a fair role in it? Is it going to be supportive? And I would advocate for more state activity. I would not advocate to loosen to the point where cities and towns would not have a 40B obligation.
Thank you. Treasurer O'Brien.
I've talked to a number of people across the Commonwealth who are very concerned about 40B legislation. I do believe that promoting affordable housing in Massachusetts has to be an important priority for all of us here. I believe that we should be doing everything that we can to provide greater incentives, greater carrots, if you will, but I do think that the so-called stick of 40B, while it needs to be tailored, while it needs to be scaled back, we do need to be able to provide some penalties to communities, because otherwise I don't think that we're going to be able to get that broad base of affordable housing. I do agree with the Secretary. I do think that we have to look at the caps. I've talked to people when, in their communities, when you're talking about developments of 200 and 300 units, that's just not fair. No one community should bear that immediate burden of a significant number of units that will tax the existing resources. But on the state level, we can be doing a number of things to make communities' jobs a lot easier. One of the things that we need to be doing is expanding some of the resources to help with the basic, the side impacts of expanded housing in a community. I actually called upon Governor Cellucci a year ago on the day that he announced a housing initiative package. The same day he called for cutbacks in the Water Pollution Abatement Trust program. That is the most efficient way that we can help communities either expand their clean water programs, their dirty water programs, or help individual communities with grants for septic systems. One of the reasons why expanded housing in a suburban community or a smaller community is difficult is because it taxes the existing resources, the schools, the sewers, things like that. That's one of the areas that we can help communities face some of those burdens by added housing. There are other programs that we can be working and doing a better job in the state to promote affordable housing. The American Dream Program, which is run through the Treasurer's Office, helps families get lower interest, get into loans for a smaller down payment, so families can afford to buy housing here in this Commonwealth where the costs have been skyrocketing. There are other innovative programs. The community of Concord has set up a program using public and private monies to create a fund whereby the community literally purchases an equity interest in someone's home. Once that person can come in, if a house is worth $400,000, $500,000, the price to that person may be $300,000 or $200,000. The community owns the other portion. After that person sells the house, the community shares in the profit from that investment. So there are creative ways, I think, that we can be working to expand housing opportunities in this state, and the burden doesn't have to be just on communities. We need to be working to find those creative solutions, but I do think we need the carrot as well as the stick, but we can make that program much less painful for communities in a number of ways.
Thank you. Senator?
Thanks, Jerry.
We've got a housing crisis in Massachusetts, and I remember when I was going to law school, my dad sat me down and said, you know, Warren, you're the first in the family to go to college, and now you're going to law school. But you can't forget where you came from. You can't forget your roots. You can't forget your working class background. My dad was a railroad conductor and worked on the railroad for 40 years. And he told me about how he and my mom were, when they started their family, they started in a federal housing project and lived there and got their first roof over their head because they were able to get some support, some assistance from the federal government, and they later purchased their home in Watertown, which they lived in for, I don't know, 40 or so years before they both died in 1995. When they died, my siblings and I all got together and we said, you know, how can we honor the legacy of Mom and Dad? And we decided to sell our parents' home at a little bit below market rate to the Watertown Housing Partnership entity, which sold it to, I guess we sold it to some individuals through the Watertown Housing Partnership entity, so that this family with 4 kids could have a place to start their family and a place to call their own, as the government had done with my mother and father. And I think we can't turn our back on providing some affordable housing assistance to people in Massachusetts. I, like my 2 counterparts here, support the percentage of 10% on affordable housing. I also believe that there are things we can do with 40B to make it work better for communities. I've heard instances from local officials that I've met with throughout the state where developers come to a local town or city hall and say, here's my proposal. If you don't do this, I'm going to turn around and make it bigger and go to the state and try to ram it down your throat, basically, through the 40B process. Well, that's inappropriate. That's unfair, and those restrictions ought to be tightened up so that there's a significant waiting period before a developer can turn around and go back to a city and town and try to ram things down their throat. That's not the purpose of 40B. And we ought to make sure that people are trying to take advantage of the system like that cannot do so. So while I support restrictions and limitations and tightening of 40B, I'm not willing to sacrifice the goals of affordable housing at a time when housing is more of a crisis today than at any time it has been during my lifetime.
Thank you. There are a few questions on the economy, and let me summarize it by asking it this way. And I'm sorry, I forget who begins on
The treasurer.
Treasurer, okay. Basically, the state has obviously, as we've heard tonight, problems with the budget, and there are needs that may go unmet. Do you have any ideas on how to increase revenues so that we can meet the priorities of the state?
That was an easy one.
That's why I gave it to you.
You know, one of the things that I've been working on as the treasurer is I chair the Lottery Commission. And while some people have varying degrees of support or lack thereof of the lottery, that has been one way that under our office we've been able to return additional monies to cities and towns. The first thing that we've done is we've managed the lottery better. We've continued to streamline the operations there. We've continued to improve the efficiencies And during the course of time that I've been as working as treasurer, we have returned an additional $100 million to the communities of Massachusetts. Now that is obviously something that we did a number of years ago. We were looking to find ways to create more resources for cities and towns. But one of the troubling aspects of that is now that we've uncapped the lottery funds, now that you communities are now counting on every single penny of profit that we're generating, we're coming a little bit to the end of the line here. I'm not sure that I can continue to guarantee the significant returns that we've had down in Braintree. But this year, we're going to be working diligently, especially because we understand the problems that you're going to be having in terms of supporting your local programs. And I know that this aid is really important to you because it's unrestricted. So I'm going to be doing everything I can this year to return more money to cities and towns. We've announced that we're going to be cutting our budget at the lottery by an additional $1 million to help create more efficiencies. That is, again, my one answer. It doesn't answer the whole budget crisis. It's not $1.5 billion in additional revenues. But what I've been trying to do as treasurer is make government work more efficiently. We've cut, as I described earlier, we literally cut the cost of interest between $200, $300, and possibly $400 million. Just yesterday, as I stated, we talked about a $17 million $17 million in monies that we're returning to the people sitting at the budget negotiating table saying, look, here from our office, this is $17 million that you can find much more productive ways to use that. So I've been committed from one side to not only generating some additional revenues, but even more importantly, taking the inefficiencies out of government so that the money that's left over you can use much more efficiently, whether it's for schools or fire or police or for other broader initiatives from the Commonwealth.
Thank you. Senator?
Sure. A couple things that come to mind right off that we ought to be doing and that the governor ought to be engaged in. Number one, I would actively seek to promote regional tourism. Our tourism industry during the fall has been devastated by the September 11th attacks. And what we need to do and what we ought to be encouraging is tourism that encourages people to utilize all of Massachusetts and our neighbors in the northeast states to travel, whether it be by car or by hopefully plane when people are ready to get back, but also by train or bus and the like. Regional tourism is a very important component of our economy, and it has been suffering very significantly, and we need to do what we can to help it. Secondly, the second point of my four-point plan would be to utilize creative approaches within our tax structure to encourage industries that are growing to locate in Massachusetts. I was the chair of the Taxation Committee. I wrote a number of the tax cuts that passed during the 1990s and utilized the tax structure as much as I could to encourage companies and businesses to locate, to grow, to expand in Massachusetts. I'm thinking, of course, of the biotech industry, the industry where we have envirotechnology is going to be a growth component of the national economy. Certainly, given the events that have taken place in bioterrorism and the like, we ought to be doing more in investing in this industry. And by the way, this doesn't cost us anything. If we don't have an industry here in Massachusetts, giving tax incentives that get them to locate here does not cost anything. Thirdly, I would tighten our belts, as I indicated, and also apply laws and ensure that entities that are responsible to pay certain amounts actually do. I learned the other day that state insurance regulators failed to assess a statutory required annual surcharge on property and casualty insurers, which robbed the state's lead paint poisoning program of $429,000. The state failed to bill 17,000 agents. How can that happen? That's $500,000 for a lead paint poisoning program. That's a shame. It's $500,000 that we will not recoup, and we ought to be tightening our belt, making the cuts where appropriate, and ensuring we get the revenues where we ought to. Finally, the last thing, and this is what separates me from anyone else, I don't take money from special interests. The maximum contribution to my campaign is $100. And basically what that means is that special interests are not going to have their way with me. I rely on $5 and $10 and $25 campaign contributions and hopefully the public matching system to fund my campaign. Special interests ought to be taken out of the political system. And I'm fighting to do that by example and as well as by leadership. And we need to get special interests out of the process on Beacon Hill because it's costing all of us money.
Secretary Gallo.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to run a department that in fact makes money. The amount of revenue that comes in through my department exceeds $100 million a year. And I'm very proud of that, and we try to be very efficient in our operation of it and try to make sure that we get fees appropriate for whatever it is that we do, and we do quite a lot of things for our business and other aspects of our society. But I would be naive, and I know you're not naive enough to believe that that $100 million, as proud as I am of it, is going to solve the types of problems we really have. I think the key to our revenue situation now may be judicious tax delays, as we just spoke about a few minutes ago, or perhaps additional taxes if they're appropriate for health care, for instance, on tobacco. Those are all things that we can discuss. But really the key to this is finding a way to make sure that our economy does not grow deeply into this recession to the point that it's going to take years to recover. That really is the key. And if we've learned anything from our experiences of 10 years ago, is that the deeper we dig in, the longer it's going to take to get back and the longer it's going to take to get our revenues up. And therefore, I'm very troubled by the lack of interest, or the apparent lack of interest, by the present administration in some of the layoffs that are going on. We have many large corporations in Massachusetts, Fidelity and Raytheon and others, that have clearly potential, at least, to continue in business. They have resources, they have assets. I think we should be making an effort, and I might add, these corporations were not at all shy or bashful about coming to the state looking for tax relief when times were good. We should be trying to keep as many people employed as possible. I can tell you, because my office administers most of the registries of deeds in Massachusetts, that the increasing number of foreclosures is already becoming apparent. Many people who were laid off in the first round, even prior to September 11th, are now running up against the wall. And they may be in your communities. They're not just in some of the older urban areas, and they're not just people at the lower economic rungs. They're people who had good jobs that were paying them good money and had homes and mortgages, and they're not able to make those payments. So it's important for us, I think, to think about the overall health of our state's economy. And I think that's a critically important job for a governor. And I don't think the present administration is doing it. I think that's the way you make sure revenues are there. When times are good, or at least sustainable, you can bring in revenue. There is no magic way. I think we learned some very difficult lessons in the late 80s and early 90s. Not only the pain of spending cuts, but the fact that if you tax and tax and tax after you've done the spending cuts and you don't pay attention to the economy, it's going to take an awful long time to recover.
Thank you. For the last phase, we'll have a closing statement and give each of you 4 minutes if you need it for the closing statement. And let's see, we begin with...
I think it's me. I think it's you.
Yes, it is.
Now, do we get points off, Jerry, if we don't use our full 4 minutes? Would anyone be upset at me?
No one would. I was just giving you a little extra
Okay,
time since
great.
it's 3 instead of 4.
Thank you. Thank you to the Suburban Coalition. Thank you for paying attention to us and listening to the, hopefully, the person will be the next leader of our Commonwealth, one of us, in the years to come. I believe now more than ever we need leadership for our state. We have an airport that's under siege. We have a turnpike that's running off a cliff. We have a severance package, or do we? We have a tunnel that's leaking 25,000 gallons a minute. We have not had an inspector general since the summer, and we still, in November, the last state in the union, do not have a budget. Now more than ever, we need a leader. We need someone who's going to stand up against business as usual, who's going to fight for the people of Massachusetts, not for special interests, not for the gang on Beacon Hill, but for all of us, the residents of our state. I've stood up when I was in the legislature, and I've stood up during my time in the private sector. I've stood up against business as usual. I stood up to Billy Bulger. I fought to scale back the Big Dig and the MWRA, and I pushed for meaningful oversight. I fought for campaign finance reform and ethics reform when I thought it was needed, although it didn't make me popular on Beacon Hill, and I was successful. Now, as I challenge the business as usual approach to Beacon Hill, I'm going to fight hard to get there, and I'm going to fight even harder when I become your next governor. Why? Because I believe it matters. Because I believe that those programs that gave my
parents' start in life are important. And I want to make that connection for those young people who don't believe in the political process anymore, all those people who feel disenfranchised and are not paying attention because they believe that their vote doesn't matter because they're not contributing to the political process via the campaign finance system. We've got to change the way we do things. That's why I'm running as a clean elections candidate. It's not just about clean elections, because clean elections is not an end in of itself. It is a means to an end. It's a means to an end to have a governor who cares about public education, who cares about our affordable health care system, who cares about helping communities grapple with their roads and their bridges as they deteriorate, who's not going to pay attention to the well-heeled lobbyists on Beacon Hill, but instead will pay attention to you. If you want a candidate, the status quo, I'm not your person. If you want someone who's going to shake things up, who's going to stand up to business as usual, I hope you'll join my effort. I hope you'll visit my website, warrentolman.com, and get involved as we change the way business is run and the way politics is run in Beacon Hill. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to working with you in our quest to make Massachusetts a better place to work, to live, and to raise a family. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for hosting us this evening. In less than a year, Massachusetts is going to be choosing a new governor, and it couldn't come at a more important time for this state. For the last 10 years, the people of Massachusetts have been passed like a baton from one Republican governor to the next to the next. There has been little stability and very little accomplished. We have many problems in Massachusetts. We have a healthcare system that's literally falling apart. We have community hospitals that are on the brink of closing. We have HMOs that don't provide the services that are necessary. We've spoken tonight about the educational problems we have, running from one end of Massachusetts to the other. It's not simply about one community or another, it's about all of Massachusetts. We recognize now more than ever the fragility of our state's economy, that in fact our economy is not as robust as it once seemed, and indeed all of our citizens can well be hurt by that. Yes, these are all important issues that have not been addressed and must be addressed. And it surely is about leadership. I'm sure there'll be no disagreement about that. But it is also about stability, diligence, and management. As Secretary of the Commonwealth and in my other responsibilities in government previous to that, I've always taken up the challenge and I've always delivered the results. Whether it was the census or any other thing that I dealt with, I've dealt with it effectively. And I think that is what's necessary. Being governor is more than about simply photo ops. It's about leadership, it's about results, it's about achievement, it's about management, and it's paying attention to the details. Those of you in this room who are involved in their local government know the hours you spend. You know the time it takes to get it right, and that has to be the way it is in Massachusetts. We have to have clear goals, better schools for our children, a health care system that makes sense, in my view, universal health care, and making sure that we have the type of system in place in Massachusetts that's going to achieve those goals. We have not had that for the last 10 years. We have had no accountability. We have had no effort to manage in detail all of the issues that state government has to deal with. Governance at the state level, just like at the local level, is about getting the job done. It's about setting clear goals, determining the costs, and how we're going to get there. That has been what I have been able to do during my tenure. I'm very proud of what I've accomplished. I believe that I have the skills that are necessary to make sure that these goals can be achieved in the years to come. This is the type of commitment that has to be there. I believe I have those skills. I will be asking for your consideration. Thank you very much.
Treasurer O'Brien, you get the last word.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for staying so late tonight and for paying attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to meet you and to talk to you about the issues of concern to all of us. One of the things that I missed tonight was putting my 2-year-old daughter, Reagan, to bed. Running for public office, and everyone up here has children and has family responsibilities. One of the sacrifices you make is your family, and that's a very, very tough thing. But the reason that I'm running is because I care so much about the future for my daughter, Reagan Ann Hayes. I want to make sure that she grows up in a Massachusetts where we have schools that are going to be providing our children with the best education that we possibly can. We want to get the best, most qualified teachers that our children can learn from. We want to live in a state that has a healthcare system that provides healthcare for as many people as we possibly can, that makes sure that the care that people receive in hospitals will be adequate, will be good. We want to make sure that we live in a state where people have jobs, where they can adequately support and comfortably support their families. All of these things that everyone in this room, I'm sure, shares in terms of their concern, all of these priorities are going to be severely challenged over the course of the next several years. But in spite of these, not only in spite of these challenges, but because of these challenges, I'm running because I want to create a better Massachusetts, not only for my daughter, but for all of your families throughout this region. I believe that I'm the only candidate running for governor who brings a couple of credentials that are very important. One, I've worked in the legislature. I have a proven record of experience changing the way we do business up in Beacon Hill. We've passed legislation, an investment tax credit, that helps create jobs. We've passed legislation that helps, and we've talked an awful lot about local communities, that helps local communities pay their health care bills. I've worked to support education reform and to improve funding for education here in this Commonwealth. But I believe I am the only candidate running who has the experience of managing a large administration, coming in, rolling up your sleeves, making the tough choices, demanding honest budgets, and making sure that we return as much money as possible to the taxpayers of Massachusetts so that we can focus on those priorities that I earlier listed. I think you have many talented people who are looking to become the next governor, but I believe I'm the one who is uniquely qualified with the level of independence, the experience to get the job done, and the person who will set the right priorities as our Commonwealth moves forward. Again, I thank you very much for your time, for your attention, and I look forward to talking to all of you here, and to the people who aren't here tonight, look forward to talking to them as well. Thank you.
Actually, I lied. I have the last word, and that is to thank the candidates for coming and doing such a wonderful job on the grilling, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Sharon.
Good night. See you later. Good night.
I'm sorry. Have a bigger crowd. That's okay. It's a wonderful job.
It's a tough night, you know, after the elections and